Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back for another edition of the solo podcast. And this week, I want to talk about hand building DFS lineups and managing a small portfolio of DFS teams. So, not talking about big MME sets or even 20 max sets, but for anyone who's making as few as 2 hand build teams a week up to, let's say, 10 hand build teams a week, I think this episode is relevant and pertinent to you. Um, and I use the term hand build loosely. Anyone who follows my stuff knows that I use the optimizer over at Solver with the ETR projections and the ETR sims and run sims over there to help me decide which lineups I want to play. But I'm still deliberately choosing the lineups I want to play, uh, even if I have some help generating those initial lineups and some help testing which lineups are the best, as opposed to, someone who's doing an MME set of 150 teams. You're generally not hand picking which 150 teams you're entering into a contest. You're using some sort of optimizer or sim and some sort of sorting methodology to pare down to your teams that hopefully, reflect your exposures. But there's definitely challenges when you are managing a small set of hand build teams. It seems like it would be easy, but a lot of times it's even harder than managing an MME set. An MME set, it's possible to kind of play all your takes for the week and set an exposure setting on certain players and make sure, you've got a cluster of undervalued wide receivers. Like last week, for example, I really loved the mid-tier wide receivers, Mike Evans, DK Metcalf, Brian Thomas Jr. Liked Mike Evans the most, Brian Thomas Jr. the least, but still liked him a good bit. And you can scale your exposures accordingly in an MME set and just make some rules, make sure you get some good teams and whatnot. But for me, a lot of times I'm making 3 lineups in a week, and I sometimes that's 2 hand builds. Sometimes I'll play the Wildcat where I'm entering 5 to 10 lineups and I get a little bit higher, but it can be challenging, and um, it's very different week to week as well. It's hard to have a hard and fast rule. And I did actually get a question about this from Joey Rudman, who, if you have not listened to his Evan Silva impression, you can find on the Establish the Run X feed. It's absolutely hysterical. But his question was about how he usually plays 9 main slate tournaments, 4 to 6 on DK, 4 to 6 on FanDuel, has his own system for building a player pool that he feels good about, worried it might be too big though, and asked me to share, kind of the range of how many players per position to consider having in your pool for around 9 tournaments. He's worried it's too many. For right now, he's got 5 to 6 quarterbacks, 12 to 14 running backs, 18 to 20 receivers, 6 tight ends. So right off the bat, I'd say to Joey, and like reflecting my own opinion, it's not going to be the same every week. And I'll talk a little bit about why. It would be nice if that was the answer. It might save you some sanity and some critical thought each week to just kind of be able to lay out what the correct diversification was and just stick to that week in and week out. But each week's different. So for me, 2 weeks ago, I was playing the 555 milli. I was playing a 300-person tournament and the Thunderdome, which is a really small tournament. There were 3 stacks I really liked. I knew exactly which contest I wanted to play each stack in, kind of based on the risk reward. And then based on the costs of my stacks, the running backs pool that I loved that week, I kind of was able to naturally diversify across those 3 stacks and get exposure to all the main running backs I wanted to. So it was real easy. It broke pretty perfectly. Unfortunately, weeks like that are rare. Much more likely we get a week like last week where I had 1 game stack I wanted, but it was a weird week. I talked about an ETM. I didn't think correlation was quite as important. So I thought about, playing, naked Mariota teams that could go in any direction because it's not as correlated. And then between those 2 teams, I'm filling less spots than when I'm stacking. So I have a lot of decisions to make between those 2 teams. I mentioned those mid-tier receivers that I really liked last week. And you sometimes get to a point where, you're not sure if you want to double up on the one receiver that you like most when you're making this few teams and then get 0 to, ones that you liked, but not as much, or do you just split that? So in this case, I talk about liking Mike Evans more than Brian Thomas, but having them sort of in this tier. And it's hard when you're building a few teams because the swings are wide, right? Like I either play 2 Mike Evans and 0 Brian Thomas Jr., which doesn't totally reflect how I feel, or I play 1 Mike Thomas and 1 Brian Thomas Jr., more diversified, but again, doesn't totally reflect how I feel. And I really like Mike Evans. And I've got my teams up on the screen. Don't judge them too bad because there was definitely some emergency late swap on my teams this past week if you're watching on the YouTube channel, but you don't really have to see it. I just didn't want my mug so big on the YouTube channel, so I shared that screen. But I'll go into those teams a little bit later. But the point is, it can be really tough, and you can kind of start driving yourself in circles where you're trying to, find these teams that give you the exact mix of players that you like for the week. And when I get into kind of this, I guess, circular logic where I'm like running up against a wall, trying to like make 2 teams that perfectly give me the right mix, or 3 teams, 4 teams, 5 teams, whatever it is, I do think it's important to take a step back and remind yourself of 2 things. One, if you're using the Sims, I know not everybody listening to this is, and in fact, maybe a minority is, but for those that don't know who the Sims are on Solver, you can simulate a projected lineup in a DFS tournament and get a projected ROI for how well that tournament does. And it's a nice way to kind of like test if you've got the right amount of correlation, do you have the right amount of leverage, do you have the right amount of team total projection. But sometimes the Sims can drive you nuts where you're trying to almost force it what to tell you, in terms of like, you want it, rephrasing that, you want it to in some way give you 2 lineups that sim amazingly, that are diversified perfectly. And that's just not realistic. The point of the Sims is to give you a rough idea of if a lineup is good enough, pulls enough of the right levers, and sends you in the right direction, but you don't want to kind of be a slave to it and have to see the best ROI on every single lineup, or else you'll drive yourself crazy, especially if you're trying to diversify a little bit. Secondly, and this is for whether you're using Sims or not, the most important thing we want to do when we're building DFS rosters is to make good lineups. I realize that's vague, but again, good lineups, we're checking those boxes. Do we have enough leverage to separate from the field? Are we sacrificing too much projection to get that leverage or not? Do we have the right amount of correlation for this specific week? And some lineups really make more sense than others, and some players are going to fit into more lineups than others, even if there's another player that you think is a similar value proposition on the week in a vacuum. But we're not playing in a vacuum. We're not building lineups in a vacuum. So it's important to have that reminder, because if you're forcing a mishmash of players across a handful of lineups just to get your exposures right, you might be sacrificing the strength of each lineup. And then all of a sudden you've got 5 inferior lineups because you were trying way too hard to diversify and get all the exposures that you wanted perfectly. So, if you find yourself not being able to do that, or spinning your wheels a bit on a given week, it's possible that MME is a better choice for you. I do think part of this too is we do all have our habits in terms of the contests we like to play each week. I do think in a perfect world, and Dink gave me this advice a couple weeks ago when I wasn't sure what contest I want to play, it might make sense to wait to register for your contests until you've got a better feel for the slate. There's going to be some slates where you see a whole bunch of angles that you could potentially take that might make more sense for you to like, hey, don't enter these higher dollar 3 max tournaments. Instead, find a lower dollar 150 MME tournament that you can enter, and then you can kind of play all your exposures or your takes. Or there will be weeks the opposite, where you got a couple stacks you really like, you think are clearly better than everyone else, and maybe you've got a tighter core of players, and it's easier to play 3 max. Not that you need a tight core of players to do 5 hand builds, and you can have a diversified set of 5 hand built lineups, but just kind of my point being that in a perfect world, you would sort of dictate your contest selection based on where you see the edges on the slate. I'm not the best at following my own advice here, but it is something to consider, because I know it's really hard to devote energy to everything every week, to have an MME set, to have a high stakes single entry, to have, 3 hand bills in like a mid stakes tournament, can be difficult. So helps to focus on that. But back when this podcast, Establish the Edge, first started with myself and Pat Corain, we did an episode on like kind of finding your edge and maximizing it. And um, I like to think about that in DFS terms a lot, where on a given week, we can get distracted again by having all these different plays or angles we might want to play. It might be players you want to get into your lineup, or it might be players you want to fade in your lineup, especially like this past week. That's a chalk. And I think it's important to like really kind of like step back and think and use whatever tools you have to help you, whether it's the ETR content, whether it is the solver sims. Where is actually your edge on a given week? How do you maximize that edge? And then maybe diversify around that. So instead of ending up with 5 teams with kind of a random mix of players that you like, with none of these teams individually really being a very good lineup that's very optimized or leveraged, you would kind of have these concepts of like, how am I going to beat the field this week? And again, that can lead to more or less diversity. If you think the field is overplaying the chalk, like on a week like last week where we had a chalk, but you don't think any of the individual chalk pieces are bad, you might do something like I did. I played 3 different lineups last week, and each lineup kind of faded a different piece of the chalk. One faded Mason, one faded Trey McBride, one faded really heavily on Marcus Mariota in the Thunderdome, which I'll talk about a little bit. So the idea, again, you can have an edge and it doesn't mean you're all in on something. That edge could be nebulous. The field's going to play too much chalk in conjunction. I can play 3 pretty diversified lineups and fade different elements of chalk in each of those lineups. So that's one way you can do it. Or, for me, I ended up, in addition to rotating the chalk fades, really deciding in the 300 person luxury box that I played that, okay, I really think Mike Evans in particular is a step above the other mid-tier wide receivers. And as a result, I ended up playing him on both of my lineups. Obviously, didn't get the result I hoped for. But I kind of decided that that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in on Evans and kind of make him and Mariota. I think these naked Mariota teams with low-owned mid-tier wide receivers, that's my edge on the week. Rotate fades at the running back position, take different shots at contrarian running backs early. And then I can play Kenneth Walker and flex on all my teams and late swap if I need to, which sadly I needed to. So you can sort of see how I mix and match. Like I'm all in on a couple things. I have Mariota naked on both teams. I have Mike Evans naked on both teams. But then I have one team where I play Josh Jacobs alongside Jordan Mason. Got Josh Jacobs at 7%. Really like that ownership. I have another team where I decided to double down on contrarian lineups and fade Jordan Mason. I played Saquon Barkley at 10%, Breece Hall at 3%. Got the ownerships I wanted. Whether or not I played well and went overboard fading the chalk is a different conversation. The kind of point is how to put together these handful of lineups that you're hand building. So on a different slate, this could look, very different. It really depends on the specific slate. Where is your edge? You might have, actually, let me talk about 2 other concepts around that, like going hedging and then the opposite being like all in on a concept. So I don't think you're ever going to hedge your lineups intentionally where you're saying like, you're worried about overplaying Bijan in one lineup, so you play Drake London in another lineup. I don't think you want to hedge it in terms of like playing it safer, but there are some times where you can see where lineups can head in different directions, and bear with me while I try to articulate this correctly, but there might be a week where maybe like last week, even though Atlanta got shut out, but let's say you really think Atlanta is an important offense for that particular week, right? And Bijan's kind of chalky. You think he's good chalk, but you also see some leverage in fading him in certain combinations, and you're doing a 3 max. You might say, hey, I'm going to do a Bijan lineup, a Kyle Pitts lineup that fades Trey McBride, also gets that leverage, and then a Drake London lineup, which gives me my mid-tier sort of wide receiver play that I'm looking at. Like, I want these single digit owned, mid-priced, high upside wide receivers. And you could have maybe these 3 lineups in a 3 max that you're not necessarily trying to hedge, but you're just saying, hey, I think there's a ton of upside in the Atlanta offense. I want to get it right in a way that's important. So I'll play Bijan, where maybe I fade Jordan Mason. I'll play Kyle Pitts alongside, some running back chalk, because I know most of the field is going to show up with Trey McBride or some other, or Tyler Warren. And then I'll have the Drake London team where I'm fading Bijan. I can still play some chalk running backs and like do tight end a little bit differently. So I had a slate last year towards the end of the season where I qualified for the DraftKings final that I kind of did this. I played sort of like 2 lineups that both told a story, and they kind of told an opposite story, and they both simmed really well, even though they were kind of contradicting one another. Because you can see if things start to go down a certain path, that one of the 2 lineups is probably going to do really well and pulls the right levers. So it was a slate where I think Anthony Richardson was was the chalk quarterback, and I played like a naked Anthony Richardson on one team, and then kind of like a Jonathan Taylor team on another team, and kind of was just playing off these. And there were like a few spots like that where, yeah, sometimes you could end up middling those. But the idea is that when you're playing a lineup that can be plus ROI, it's not always the exact same thing over and over again. Again, these lineups tell a story. Each different lineup kind of has a path to way it's going to win. And the whole point is to like zoom out and, again, prioritize whether this lineup's a good tournament lineup more so than the specific exposures. And that at times can mean diversified lineups that feel like they're hedging one another. I know it's not the cleanest sweat, but you can do that. It's also really important to get the right team in the right contest. So I did this past week a little bit. Again, maybe I didn't have the best teams out there, but I knew I wanted to play the Chargers stack, and I thought these naked Mariota teams were really good. So I played the Chargers stack in my smallest of field tournaments, where I knew a lot of people were going to show up with Mariota because they're going to be cash game lineups. And I read that right. I was the only person in the Thunderdome this week to play Justin Herbert. I got smoked because my team wasn't very good, but I was very happy. I read that right. 50% of the teams in the Thunderdome play Marcus Mariota. And again, this talks about the hedging a little bit. I get the right team in the right contest. It's not that I hate Mariota. It's just I think he's going to be over-owned in this particular contest, and I can pile on the correlation with the Chargers stuff. And then in the 300-person contest, I thought the Mariota ownership would come down. It came down. It was half of what it was in the Thunderdome, still much higher than I would have liked. He came in at 26%, but I was able to do that there. And there I took less of a correlation approach. And you can see I really kind of tried to hit on the mid-tier, low-owned wide receivers across the board and some contrarian running backs. I always think it's a little bit easier to do this hedgy type lineups on late swap weeks, where the line, as kind of, it's unlikely both lineups are going to do really well. And the lineup that goes on the right path in the 1 o'clock games, you can chalkify a little bit. And the lineup that doesn't go quite on the right path in the 1 o'clock games, you can late swap into something a little bit more contrarian and still give yourself an out. But it's also okay to go all in too. So I know Sam Brott this past week in the power sweep, he made a bunch of power sweep lineups, all with some different pieces of contrarian information early, all with Chicago-Dallas stacks set up, with the idea of like, this Chicago-Dallas game is maybe too chalky overall, but I can spread out across 9 power sweep lineups or whatever it was. I can spread out the contrarian information I get early, hopefully hit kind of the nuts on 2 or 3 of those in a really good shape to keep iterations of the Chicago-Dallas stack. If not, the other ones I can late swap off to stuff that's a little bit more contrarian. And I do think it's okay to sort of we have a tendency to think about, if I'm entering the game changer for $1,500, that's one team and I'm making the best version of the team. But then if I'm entering, 5 teams in the Wildcat, which is about the same total amount in entry fees, oh, I have to diversify these teams and play completely different lineups. It's possible on a given week that instead of playing the $1,500 game changer, you play 5 Wildcats with the same stack, with the same contrarian running back. And it's as if you're playing one lineup with slightly different branches around it. And again, that's what we're talking about. We want to maximize our edge and diversify around it. So if you find the one lineup you really like, you want to play the 1500 single entry. But if you're not sure about the pieces around it, that's where you can make a few more entries, but still around this core concept that sort of translates to every single lineup. I do think you can think of it that way, as those 5 entries are really one lineup with like different avenues, like slightly different avenues and paths to winning. So, so thinking of it as like one contest entry, even though it's actually 5 different entries. The truth is, you got to find the right balance. As much as you want a process that's repeatable each week in terms of the depth of your player pool, the truth is that's going to change. There's going to be weeks where you think there's 1 or 2 stacks that are far superior than the rest, that you're going to want to maybe only play 2 to 4 quarterbacks, all from those 2 games. There's going to be weeks where you think there's 3 or 4 great running backs and you want to play 10 different lineups rotating these 3 or 4 great running backs, and you're unsure which stack to play, and you play 8 different quarterbacks across different stacks. You got to maximize your edge specific to that week. There's always going to be some feel here, which is tough. But the truth is, I've been doing this for a long time and I drive myself crazy every week. I start spinning my wheels in terms of like, oh, I made this lineup that looks great with Mike Evans, but I already had Mike Evans in this lineup, so now I have to change this lineup to get Brian Thomas Jr. in. And you drive yourself crazy every week, but the point is to kind of get it in as good as you can possibly on each given week and then just move on to the next slate. So you do have to be able to live with like, oh, if I had done what I usually do this week, I would have won. And you will drive yourself a little bit crazy in that regard, but I think it's worth it over the long run to try and think through this stuff critically in each week as its own week. So I know I rambled a bit. Still working on tightening up these solo pods. Appreciate everybody kind of hanging in there and listening to me talk through this stuff. I hope it's helpful. Please continue to give me ideas for future ones, and hopefully this will help you. I know it didn't end up giving anyone any hard and fast rules, but in terms of ways to think about how to manage, 2 to 10 lineups that you're hand building each week. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Best of luck in week 4.